Okay, hello everyone. This is the very last session of the main workshop, and with that, we also have our last keynote speaker, which is Renato Braghiere, who's going to talk about Mind the Carbon Gap. Well, that's the title at least. So Renato is a research scientist at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. And he leads the land modeling development for the Climate Modeling Alliance CLIMA, which is an Earth system model designed to learn directly from observations by leveraging advances in computational and data sciences. He holds a PhD from the University of Reading, UK, and conducted fieldwork in the Amazon rainforest using flux towers and spectral measurements while at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He has previously worked at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in France and the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Italy. His research focuses on radiative transfer, the global carbon cycle, and land-atmosphere feedbacks, with an emphasis on integrating satellite observations and advancing remote sensing applications in land surface modeling. And with that, I would like to introduce Renato.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be here. It's such a great pleasure to be in Australia and hearing all the cool science that you guys have been doing here. So today, the title of my presentation is Mind the Carbon Gap. I will spend the first chunk of the presentation talking a lot about some of the things that keep me up at night, my own research, and why I call the carbon gap. You're going to understand why. The second part is to talk about the CLIMA model that we're developing at Caltech and MIT and JPL. And I will finish with some practical results from the CLIMA land, the land component of this newer system model, and hopefully give some a few things for us to think after the presentation. So for this crowd, I don't want to spend too much time here, but as complex as their system is, it's fascinating that the relationship between CO2 emissions and global average temperature is linear. And so we really just need to know how much we emit, and we're pretty much going to know how much the global surface temperature is going to be. But that is because we have two very well-behaved carbon sinks. So we have the ocean carbon sink here on the plot B, and the land carbon sink on plot C. They have been acting as behaved sinks so far, but it's actually important to understand if they will keep soaking up the carbon that we're putting up there in the future. And so when we look at the ocean carbon sink, we're able to distinguish between scenarios in the future. But when we look at the land, the uncertainty bars are so huge that we are not even able to distinguish what the land will do in terms of carbon sink in the future. So what do I do? What do I call the carbon gap? So what are these land and ocean sinks that I talked about before? So this figure I took from the latest global carbon project in for last year. And this plot shows the global ocean flux on the y-axis and the land flux on the x-axis. And do I have a pointer? I don't. But anyway, the cross that is next to GCB is what we think the ocean and the land sinks are. And these numbers I calculated via land surface models and global ocean models that are represented by the green dots up there, the land models, and the purple triangles here, the ocean models. But what is actually important to say is that we are also able to constrain the sinks via CO2 atmospheric inversion. So we have satellites orbiting Earth and measuring the CO2 column, so we can get an independent estimate, which are represented by these purple squares. And we can also use oxygen isotopes to divide the partitioning between the land and ocean sinks, which is represented by that orange square. And that's why I call the carbon gap. So there's a gap in between the GCB calculation and the O2. I thought it would be interesting for this crowd in particular to show what the Australians say that the sinks are. So here is cable pop up there in red, and here is access CSRO here in red triangle. And we can see that the Australian carbon gap is actually smaller than the global. So you guys are doing a relatively good job, but we still see a gap there. Now, another gap, so we have this global gap, and we also have a regional gap. The regional gap is that when we compare now inversions in purple bars and the land surface models in green, we see that the northern hemisphere underestimate inversions, and we see the opposite sign in the tropics. And so our observations and models have a mismatch, not only globally, but also regionally. Now, a friend of mine published this paper in Nature a few months ago, and pretty much what they did in this study was to get the change in carbon sink from the 90s, represented by the black curves, and compare with biomass change on land. And biomass is something well constrained on land because we have satellite data with LiDARs and radar and forest inventory, so we have a pretty good idea how biomass has changed on land since the 90s. But when we look at what the DGVMs are saying, the models are saying that all this extra carbon sink is going to live in biomass. And when we look at the satellite, we don't see that at all. And so they are arguing in this paper that they're still missing processes in the land models that don't account for non-living carbon. Things like furniture, or non-living carbon that end up in the bottom of reservoirs and things like that. So we don't represent any of that in our land models. Now, by the end of this talk, hopefully I will convince you that, yes, I agree with them. There are a bunch of processes that we do not represent in these models. But I would argue that the processes that we do represent are poorly constrained by observations. And so what are some of these processes? I'm not going to spend too much time here, but on land, we have this huge chunk of carbon coming down as photosynthesis. Almost all of that goes back to the atmosphere as respiration, microbial and plant respiration. And then we have other things that actually switch the sign of positive or negative source and sink, like fires. And when we add humans into the equation, like urbanization, disturbance, croplands, we get a lot of complexity in here. Lateral flow, and etc. Also, the pools are partly well constrained. If you look at what soils are predicted to have, we have anything between 1,500 and 2,400 petagrams of carbon. So the uncertainty is of the order of 1,000 petagrams of carbon in soils. So it's partly constrained. But the question is, now, we know that these models are not perfect, but are they getting better with time? And so in this figure here that shows the evolution of land surface modeling from the 70s all the way to CMIP6 that I taken from this paper from Rosie Fisher and Charlie Coven that were at NCAR, we see that more and more processes have been added into these land models. And in the 70s, these land models behave pretty much as the lower boundary condition for the atmospheric flow, just informing latent and sensible heat fluxes, a little bit of radiation. But then in the 80s, we realized that 70% of all latent heat came through via stomata to the atmosphere. And so representing the carbon cycle was somewhat important because we needed to understand how water was flowing through plants. And then when you add biology into a model like this, things start to get really complicated really fast. Now we need a nutrient cycle because carbon is controlled by nutrients. We need other things like dynamic vegetation because we have mortality and so on. And so when we compare now, if the models are getting better, we can use something like the International Land Model Benchmarking, which is this crazy spreadsheet that has a lot of colors here. But pretty much the idea is that models are represented in columns, and then the variables calculated by these models are represented in rows. And we have things like biomass, gross primary productivity, and etc. When we see more purple colors, it means that the models are getting better. The final two columns are the ensemble CMIP 5 and 6, and we see more purple colors in CMIP 6, which means that, yeah, we're doing a relatively good job with time. But is that fast enough? That's the question. So another quick exercise that I did here was to see where cable pop was sitting in the latest trendy exercise. So here is the latest global carbon project exercise to calculate the land sink. And we are only looking into ecosystem and carbon cycle variables in hydrology, evapotranspiration, and runoff. And then these are relative scores. So if the model is doing better than their peers. And these numbers are, these boxes are associated to relative scores. And it's really hard to see in a spreadsheet like that which model is the best, actually. And what I'm going to do here is very cheeky. Please don't share around, because I can make a lot of enemies. But if we organize this like that, cable pop will be winning in representing the ecosystem and carbon cycle variables and water variables as well. Now, hopefully no one took a picture of that, but if we think about the usual model development, we can, and this figure I took from Will Wither at NCAR talking about the development of CLM, but I'm pretty sure cable development is similar. When we move from a model version to the next, we add a lot of baggage into it without thinking much how one new process will connect to the previous ones. So the number of equations in CLM exploded from about 100 equations in the 80s all the way to above 1,000 equations in 2015, and that's really hard to constrain. And so I say that yet most models are data hungry, and yet they are not very well designed to make use of all the existing and new sources of observations that we currently have. But that's how NASA plays a role, and other space agencies. We live in a very exciting era where climate data is about to explode. And so every year we have more and more satellites orbiting Earth, measuring new variables at new spatial and temporal and spectral resolutions that will give us more and more information about the climate system. But our models are not necessarily ready to make use of all this extra data that is about to explode. Well, I do have one political slide. This is if the NASA budget gets approved for next year, this is what's going to happen with the NASA fleet. So we have lots of missions that will get canceled, missions that are extremely important, including LCO that measure some of those inversions that I talked at the beginning. But things like SBG, which is really important for some of my research that I do with hyperspectral radiative transfer. Still, we scientists, we're very resilient, and can we still learn from all the observations that are still up there? So that's the case for the CLIMA model. So we at Caltech, MIT, and JPL, we're building a new Earth system model. And the idea of CLIMA is that we can take advantage of all these new observations and generalize knowledge across locations and learn processes at scale, so being scale independent. We've heard in the past 2 days that most of the uncertainty in our system models are related to subscale processes. And so how can we actually learn processes at scale? So in CLIMA, we're building a newer system model, yet another one, but hopefully you will see why it's slightly different from the others, whose components learn from observation and simulated data. So we're actually taking deliberate steps to integrate data-driven approaches into our system models. And so one of our model development principles is that although legacy is important and we can carry a lot of knowledge from previous versions to the next, sometimes it's essential to begin anew, especially because it's really hard to change models that are so intertwined and so not often very well documented. And so sometimes it's just nice to have this opportunity to start from scratch and build something that could be brand new. And so we build this model in Julia instead of Fortran, and by building in Julia, the model is almost GPU native for free. We build a model that is modular in the sense that we can test hypotheses, and modular in such a way that it's a hybrid model. So It is constrained by physics. You're not going to create or destroy energy or mass in the model. But we can switch modules within the Earth system model that can be AI informed or machine learning driven, for example. We have a parameter derivation from model data fusion. One of the limitations of our models is that our parameters often come from a publication that, there's one publication in the 80s, we got that number from there, and we are not very sure where, how that end up there. So now we have a whole calibration pipeline built within in-house with this ESM that will derive from data this parametric space. And because it's GPU native, it's computational efficient. So we can perform multiple simulations and come up with the ensemble. First, come up with uncertainty quantification almost for free, because now we have a distribution of the parametric variability. But also it allows for us to perform multiple projections. So that's why it's nice to have a very fast model. Now, all that was to introduce what I call the carbon gap, and introduce a little bit of the concept of clima, these newer system models. If I have time, I probably won't, I can show some of the results for the atmosphere and oceans as well. But I'm going to focus here on the land surface. And the land surface is substantially different from the atmosphere and oceans, in the sense that surface heterogeneity is one of the most important things that we have to represent in the models. For the atmosphere and oceans, it's, I wouldn't say simple, but it's possible, more direct, to obtain universal parameters that control flow of fluids. On land, because we have biology, we're so driven by biology, and we have 450,000 plants on Earth, it's very hard to understand what each single plant is doing. And so to get around some of those things, we think about a few ways to do that. And so one of our ideas is to make model outputs closer to observables. Again, if we want a model that is able to absorb all the climate data that is available out there, we also need to understand that satellites don't see climate data. Satellites often see radiation, and so having a model that is more has a more appropriate way to calculate radiative transfer and simulate some of those observables, we can directly compare our model outputs with what the satellite is seeing. And some of the things that we do in the model is to calculate sun-induced fluorescence, for example. So for those who are not familiar, when plants photosynthesize, they fluoresce in very particular wavelengths, and we can now measure that from space, which works as a proxy of photosynthesis. So if you want to constrain photosynthesis on land, we are able now to constrain with solar-induced fluorescence that are directly measured by satellites, for example. To do that, we need to have a radiative transfer scheme, which can be particularly important for the land surface. And in this paper that we published a few years ago, we perform a quick exercise comparing the broadband scheme of radiation, so just calculating soil albedo in two broadbands, the visible and the near infrared, versus calculating a soil albedo that is hyperspectral. And the radiative forcing we get by simply doing that change in the model is of the order of 3.55 watts per meter square. That could be quite substantial. And that's only for soils. When we add canopies on top of that, I'm going to show what happens. But when we go hyperspectral, we open the door for so many new cool things that we can do with the model. So most land surface models nowadays use a two-stream scheme that calculates radiation in two broad bands, the visible and the near infrared. And the reasons for that was because in the 80s, it was important to have a model that had fewer parameters because we didn't have enough observations, but also that was computationally efficient. Our computers were not very good in the 80s. But when we go hyperspectral now, because I feel that in the 80s, that's 40, 50 years ago, we cannot, I mean, we could, but we should not use the excuse anymore that we don't have observations of computational power, because now we do have. And now, when we go hyperspectral, we start opening the door for cool things like pigments calculations, and things like nutrient cycles can be actually measured from space because we can measure proteins from the spectral lines of the satellite. So now we can actually constrain lots of cool traits of the vegetation that will be able to inform more of the surface heterogeneity. So if, it made sense. We know that light is made of colors for many, 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 many years now. But when we had satellites that measure very few bands, it made sense to have an Earth system model that simulated those few bands. Now that we have sensors that measure all those hundreds and hundreds of bands, doesn't make sense of actually simulating all those and how much we gain by doing so. So to do that, and this is, I'm wrapping up now in the final part of the talk where I'm going to present some of the results that we published recently, doing the same exercise of the radiative forcing for soils, but now for the entire land, including plants. And it's important to understand how we represent biodiversity in land models. So we represent biodiversity by plant functional types that, I quote, represent broad groupings of plant species that share similar characteristics in ecosystem function. This is a very, very, very broad general, thank you, very general description of what the land looks like. So if you look across the tropics, for example, we have the Amazon basin, the Congo, the maritime continent. They roughly share the same plant functional types, but we know that they respond in terms of carbon and water efficiency very differently. They are all tropical forests, but they are substantially different in their ecosystem function. But in our system models, they are pretty much the same. They share the same parametric space, they behave the same. And so why do we still use PFTs? Well, again, simplification. It's very hard to inform everything that is happening in every grid cell of your model. And so we liked observations. PFTs are simpler enough that we can use lookup tables, and we can use parameters that are time invariant. But the question is, are PFTs a sufficient representation of all this biodiversity on land? Here's the paper where we show some of the results. I invite you to read if you want more details. But pretty much what we did was to get a set of parameters that are linked to PFT on land, which are related to the optical properties of the surface, namely reflectance and transmittance in both broadbands, the visible and the near infrared. And this is how it looks like in CLM. There are a bunch of numbers there, and each row represents a different functional type. And what we did was to get leaf chlorophyll and leaf mass per area from observations, space observations, and now use the ClimaLand model to calculate these optical properties hyperspectrally. And so now, when we look at the tropics, we see that chlorophyll content, it's very different even across the Amazon basin. And remember, the Amazon basin was represented again as a single PFT. Now, when we come up with these numbers that are spatially varying in terms of reflectance and transmittance, we wanted to see what would actually happen in an Earth system model. Well, CLIMA is not coupled yet. One of our goals is to have a first land atmosphere simulation by December this year. And so we had to use a friendly Earth system model to do that. So we kind of replaced the spatial heterogeneity that was calculated by CLIMA into CSM, and we perform some calculations. I just want to say that this is the values in CLM represented by these red circles, and some of them sit outside of what is actually observed by satellite when we inform traits like chlorophyll and LMA. So these numbers came from probably a few experiments, but they were never validated in the global model. Now, when we look at what happens when we perform the global calibration, the global simulations, we find canopy albedo differences of up to 10%. And we find this dipole behavior between the northern hemisphere and the tropics. And when we run the couple model, of course, we find differences in radiative fluxes of up to 5 watts per meter square. And this could translate to 0.4 degrees warming or cooler, depending on the region. I mean, Australia in that simulation will get really, really hot in the future. not in the future, but by using a better representation of the heterogeneity of the surface. So now we observe these changes across the climate system, and when we perform some independent validation with surface albedo in the tropics, we find an improvement when we now inform the land surface heterogeneity by traits. So instead of locking PFTs across the tropics, we inform chlorophyll and LMA variability. And what we see now when we look at the carbon cycle is that the boreal area, the boreal forests get more productive, the tropics get less productive because the tropics are just warmer. They move away from the optimum, and the boreal forests get more light penetration, get more GPP. This gets even more important in the future, so we also perform some future simulations with that. And I'm about to wrap up, but I want to go back to the carbon gap that I mentioned at the beginning, and that's some of the missing processes in models. Now, by simply updating the CSM lookup table of optical properties, we close that gap in 55% in the Northern Hemisphere and in 20% in the tropics by simply tweaking one set of parameters that are related to PFT in an Earth system model. So the inclusion of trait diversity helps to explain and close the carbon gap that we saw at the beginning. So I'll stop here and conclude. So first one is that we need to take deliberate steps to integrate data-driven approaches into our system models for urgently. One way to do that is to make our model outputs closer to observables, so we can cut off the middleman and keep uncertainty quantification in-house. And also, that trait-based optics outperform PFT lookup tables, but this was one set of exercises. I think that if we get not rid of PFT because it's impossible, PFT is a good way to simplify the difficulty in representing spatial heterogeneity, but we should stop in 2025 relying so much on PFT lookup tables to inform the land, given that we have so much observation available. Yeah, and thanks to the funders. Please visit the climacontact.edu to learn more about Clima. Thank you.
Thank you, very interesting talk. Do we have a few questions?
How far away are we from a fully coupled ocean, land, atmosphere, biogeochemistry, clima model are we?
Yeah, that's the question I ask myself every morning. We have a few deadlines. So Clima started from scratch, right, 5 years ago. And when Top and Raf started the project, we had, we wanted first a very simple Earth system, not very simple, but like without the land, like prescribed land. And the project started getting bigger and bigger. It's important to say that the project is also done at universities and not climate centers. So the rotation of people that actually work on these things are grad students and postdocs that come and go. And for having a model that started from 0 5 years ago to having an independent, almost calibrated ocean, atmosphere, and land separately, it's a good thing. That said, I'm going to address your question. So the deadline for the first couple atmosphere land simulations is this December, and to have the full couple model is December next year. But biogeochemistry in ocean, we'll have to look into that. But the priority is to get the climate model right first before performing simulations. So yes, we want to be part of CMIP 7. It's our intention so far. We might not be able to, and that's okay. We're realistic about that, yeah.
Do you have another short question?
Thanks, Renato. Yeah, you mentioned the biogeochemistry in the ocean, that it's maybe still to come, but I am wondering if there's been any discussion around that, particularly thinking about the sort of radiative transfer hyperspectral relation to biology in the land model. Is there anything similar being discussed in the ocean model? You know, you have lots of observations that tell you about ocean biology, at least at the surface, including fluorescence and
Yeah. So there are a few sensors that are actually measuring fluorescence in the ocean color. Yeah, we have PACE now, which is super cool. So yeah, definitely there are these conversations going on about using ocean colors to inform some of the biogeochemistry. One thing that we're trying to avoid is that the ocean folks go towards PFTs again to inform some of the biology variability in the ocean. Although I'm not an ocean expert, I've heard plant functional types work a little better than plant functional types. I mean, but if we could go around that and not, make the same mistakes that the land did, because we're in a such a, now we have observations to constrain all that, so we don't, we should avoid classes as much as we can, if we can use observations instead. That's our principle,
Perfect, thank you much.
Thank you.
Thanks.